All right, good morning, everyone. Seems really loud. Good morning, everyone. So really is a pleasure for us to meet with you guys this morning. We established a DEI committee in 2020 under Dr. Pollack's leadership to really try to highlight, emphasize, and generate an environment of inclusion and diversity within the AHPBA. And so today we're going to talk with you a little bit about what we hope to achieve and what are some of the issues that we are facing within the organization. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Pollack to the stage to talk with us a little bit about why these issues are important to the AHPBA. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Clark. So I actually had prepared like a talk with like 25 or 30 slides. And then as I checked it in, I saw I had 5 minutes. And so I deleted all my slides except this one. Because I really don't want to be the person who's up here talking today. But I feel extremely passionately about this topic and this issue. And I'm very excited about our new DEI committee. And hopefully, as you heard in my presidential address yesterday, we've been very purposeful over the last year, trying to be strategic in the way that we can hardwire, hard bake into our association meaningful ways to promote diversity. And one way is through this Diversity and Equity Inclusion Committee. I think another way is through that AHPBA Leadership Academy. I think another way is a commitment to never having manels again, not just this year, but every year. And then I think finally is just remaining vigilant. I do worry that this is a priority this year, and I want to make sure that it remains a priority every year, because this will be a journey. We all know that this is going to take some significant work, especially where we're starting from, which again, unfortunately, is not a very diverse association. So I want to congratulate all of the members of the inaugural DEI committee, applaud their efforts, and offer them Godspeed in doing this important work. And in particular, I want to recognize Dr. Clark, who I think we could not be in better hands as the chair of this DEI committee. Calicia is really a transformative, passionate leader. And I look forward in my role as ex-president and continuing to partner with you and providing any support that I can to push these initiatives forward. So again, thank you very much for all of your efforts.
Good morning. I think one of the most important issues when it comes to addressing this as a long-term strategy, as Dr. Pollack kind of addresses issues and challenges in promotion to leadership positions in our institutions as well as in our organization. And Dr. Dilhoff from Ohio State is going to talk about that this morning. And we will save time at the end for discussions, which is why we've kept the talks quite short, so that way we can have that discussion, because I think discussion is the most important component of moving this agenda forward.
So thank you for having me. I'd like to frame this a little bit more like challenges and opportunities in the promotion to leadership. That's kind of the way I view it. And so thank you for having me. This is the first talk that I haven't chocked completely full of just data. And so I'm going to share some of my experiences with you. And so I thank you for being here and sharing and letting me share. I have no financial disclosures. I do, the real disclosure is that I'm not an expert in any of this, and I'm like making my way through like many of all of us are. But why really this issue is like, we're not here today because these are like women's issues or these are minority issues. These issues affect every single one of us. All of us should care because our teams are better when diverse. And if we all kind of take that into our daily lives, we'll all benefit from it. Women make up 57% of the US job market, 52% of early management and professional occupations, and 60% of bachelor's degrees. Women outpace men in getting master's degrees and doctorate degrees, and we've done this for the last 30 years. This isn't a new thing. And in 2019, women outpaced men in matriculation to medical school. But when we look in academic leadership, so this is all of medicine, not just surgery, we fall behind. So full professors are less than a third are college presidents. When you look at women of color, there's only 5% of women that are women of color that are presidents, and only 16% of medical school deans. We're not alone. The business world faces the same challenges that we do. About a quarter of women hold Fortune 500 board seats and C-suite level jobs. Only 7% of women are Fortune 500 CEOs, and 11% of women hold the top jobs in the S&P 1500. And when we add race into this, if you look at women of color, white women, men of color, and white men, you can look at this and you can progress left to right. Left is our entry-level jobs. And they are pretty equitable for, the percent of population. But as you progress through this, look at the women of color that start at 18%, and only 3% of women of color hold C-suite level jobs. And at the same time, our white men almost double in that. They go from 35% to 66%. Men outpace women in leadership roles in every level of corporate, in every level of in the world. So corporate, nonprofit, government, medicine, military, religion, we're outpaced in every sector. So how are we doing in HPB? So kind of our world, this paper is a paper I wrote with one of my fellows, Dr. Merrill. And this stemmed from being here at one of the meetings actually and looking around, and I thought there were lots of young, bright women that were presenting. But when I looked around at women my age, it started getting a little sparse. And I was like, where did we all go? What's happening to us? And I thought we were having a problem with attrition, like we were attracting them initially and then they were going away. Turns out I was wrong, like in lots of research, you find out something you didn't expect. And when we looked at this, so we used presenting at the AHPBA as a surrogate of interest in hepatobiliary surgery. And then we went back to 2007 and 2012. So we'd have a, over time look at this. And then we wanted them to be able to finish their training and pick a career. So we looked at them, what did they end up doing when they were done with training? And in 2007, 16.5% of the presenters were women, and almost 23% in 2012 for women. And if you followed them through to the end of their careers, both men and women ranged getting HPB jobs anywhere from 32 to 49%. And that's actually not statistically different between the men and the women. And the women, even on 1 year, they were the ones that 1 year they had 49% of the women went on to get HPB jobs. So we weren't losing them at any different rate than we were our male colleagues. We just don't attract enough women here interested in the first place. So we really need to go back a little earlier and get women interested in what we do. So all these numbers, right? Like, why do we all care? Like I said, this is my one message to you, is that diverse teams perform better. And this book by Scott Page, I actually bought here at this meeting in 2018 when he was the invited lecturer. And I thought his lecture was really great. And I bought this book and it's great. We can't go over all of it, but he basically uses some evidence to really convince us that teams are better when they include different kinds of thinkers over homogenous thinkers. And he terms this the diversity bonus. And if we really, if all of us could just, incorporate that philosophy into our daily lives, our teams will do better. Our companies will do better. Our hospitals will do better. So what are the barriers? You can kind of divide these into structural barriers, institutional mindsets, individual mindsets, and lifestyle choices. These barriers are multifactorial, they're deep-seated, they've existed for generations. These differences are propagated by both men and women. So structural barriers. Access to informal networks is really important, and you can see this. I think we get better at it, but this just site like, oh, let's go golfing, or let's go out to the bar and have drinks with our buddies. People have really good intentions, right? You're building your team, you're trying to build morale, and so I think their intentions are right in a lot of these activities. But if I just take out, my team for manicures, I'm obviously excluding people from my team. I'm probably not accomplishing what I had intended to. So making sure that we're thoughtful and purposeful when we're organizing some of these events can help us really include our entire team and make our whole team better. For institutional mindsets, you can kind of wrap this all up in this role incongruity theory. So this theory proposes that there's this difference in what we perceive female genders should be and what leaders should be. And with that incongruity, women are judged more harshly than men when they have these behaviors that aren't expected of them. And so for men, they often are associated with these agentic behaviors. So agentic is when you control your own destiny or future. And so aggressive, forceful, independent, decisive, self-reliant. And women are often more associated with these communal behaviors, kind, hopeful, or helpful, sympathetic, concerned for others. And so I kind of like sum this down into like, men also can be penalized for this, right? If their behaviors aren't congruent for what's expected of them. So they can be, forgive me, but damned if you don't. But women can really be damned if they do and damned if they don't. Because if you behave like a woman should, you probably aren't going to get, promoted the same. And if you behave in these kind of male roles, you might get judged more harshly as well. Now, I'm not making an argument that leaders should be actually put in these boxes at all. We'd probably make a better leader if we kind of moshed these all together, but that's kind of more traditional stereotype. But for women, this creates a special conflict, and that they're expected to act like a so-called leader, which are associated with these agentic terms or so-called male traits. But when they do, they're judged very harshly. This creates this tightrope that they're supposed to walk. So onto individual mindset. So sometimes we're our own worst enemies, right? We're not excused of some of the issues, and that data from business world show women don't advance beyond director roles. Sometimes they're self-selecting out of the workforce. Sometimes we're not pursuing these big roles. Are we pursuing, they're not pursuing president, vice president, C-level positions. Are we going for division chief and chair? And this for lots of reasons. It's probably a whole talk on itself, but socialization pressures, confidence or lack of confidence, risk aversion or avoiding politics, which segues right into lifestyle choices. I personally think that we all men and women make very difficult lifestyle choices. However, it is more socially acceptable for men to pick working more and have less household duties than their female counterparts. Women are 8 times more likely to take care of sick kids and manage the schedules at home. And if you add up all the work all the paid work men and women do and all the unpaid household work that men and women do, if you add those together, they're actually the same. Men are just doing more paid work than the women are. So opportunities. So this is I love to run, so I'll use some running analogies because when I was out running with a friend like many years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, and she is an executive at a company and 20 years older than I am. So she had made it in a time in a male-dominated world that really was not common to succeed. And she told me, Mary, you can continue to lead like a man and struggle, or you could lead like a woman and be very successful. And I looked at her and I'm sure I crinkled up my face and I was like, I hear you, I understand, but I don't want to do that right now. And so that's like percolated with me for a lot of years. And like how this has kind of settled out to me is like, we all shouldn't be trying to lead like a man or lead like a woman. You all should find what your strengths are and go with it. So if your strengths are, some of those more agentic characteristics, well, you should capitalize upon that. And that's how this has kind of settled out for me over the last 15 years. So what do we do? What do we do about this? I want to focus on like not all the what is the world doing to us, but what can we do about this? And so focus on yourself first, and then I'll talk about this more in one second. Recruit your team. So be very purposeful and thoughtful about who's going to help you. So who's going to mentor you, who's going to sponsor you, and don't be shy about asking them to help. Everybody's really busy. They might just not think of the opportunity for you. So go ask. I want to go to ELAM, so will you help me get there? Will you help me write this letter? Will you help me get there? And a responsibility for all of us. So for our current leaders and all of us, striving to be leaders, it's our responsibility to make things better for the next generation. So constantly challenge yourself and those around you to build diverse teams. And that's all of our responsibility. So in focusing on yourself, when you identify that next role, like, what do I want to do? I want to be a chief or a chairman, or I want to be an administrator. What do you need to do to make yourself more viable for that job? Do you need more other leadership courses that you should do? Maybe you want to go to ELAM. Do you need an MBA or an MHA? So go make sure that you're qualified for that next opportunity. And in that focusing on yourself, I think we get very caught up in emulating others right? We see these people do everything perfectly. They're publishing all the papers, their life's perfect, and we like think everything is so perfect. But sometimes you're comparing yourself to something that shouldn't be. So like, if somebody's like juggling all 16 balls and they look perfect, and you're like, I want to do that. Well, but I can't juggle. So like if I juggle 16 balls, I just drop them all on the floor and I have to pick them up and organize. So at some point, although emulating others can be helpful, you got to think about, how am I going to do this myself? What is my way of managing this? And in that same vein, like you got to find your own pace, right? Like some people are running at a pace that might not be doable for you. And so back to a running analogy, that's Meb Keflezighi when he won the Boston Marathon in 2014 and a 2:08:36, which if you're calculating that in your mind, that's a 4:55 pace. Meb can run that. Meb's been known to vomit on himself while running and not slow his pace, right? He doesn't even miss a step. Obviously, most of us can't do that. On the left, there's Brian, and you might recognize someone off of Brian's left-hand shoulder. You might recognize, we also finished, right? But we didn't run a 4:55 pace. I could make an argument that Brian might have done better had he slowed down earlier, and maybe he could have finished on his speed. And so for all of us, you got to figure out, what is that? So what is that in academic medicine? Like, what does that mean to you? How do you find that middle ground? And this Yerkes-Dodson law kind of puts this in graphic form for me very well, that you don't want to be in this low, bored, and tired. So if you're capable of a 4:55 pace, you shouldn't be walking or jogging, right? Like you don't want to be in that. You got to find your focus and engage. But you also don't want to be in this stressed and restless. Like most of us, if we run while we're running, we're probably not going to finish. So you got to find for you, what is this focused and engaged place? Changing institutional bias, this could be like an entire hour talk on its own. But for all of us, we need to prioritize an equitable workplace. So widen recruitment networks for everyone. Maybe you blind screen the CVs. Dr. Minter actually just told us about a really cool committee they had at their hospital when they make new hires. It all goes to a committee to help make sure, they're recruiting diverse candidates and hiring diverse candidates. Support internal growth opportunities for everyone. So make sure the professional development's equitable. Make sure your retention policies and your promotion and tenure policies are equitable. We know that P&T policies also often have baked in bias. So make sure your hospitals are doing this right. Promote workplace flexibility and work-life balance. And this can be very important when you're hiring young women of childbearing age. These can be really important things. And unconscious bias, and again, probably a whole nother talk, but one quick slide on, we all go to these talks on implicit bias, which I like very much, but I often leave there going, well, okay, we all have implicit bias. I know my implicit bias, but what do I do about it? And you can use this one like simple mnemonic, which is implicit. And so have introspection, like make sure, go find out what your implicit bias are, actually take these tests and know, some of the women might be very surprised that you might have an implicit bias against women. Be mindful. So when we're stressed out, we might make more, our decisions might show more of our implicit bias when we're stressed out and tired. So be mindful of, kind of your stress level and learn how to manage that. Take perspective, take the other person's perspective. So when you're evaluating these issues, make sure you're like thinking about how the other person views it or how the other group of people view this. Learn to slow down. This kind of goes in that mindful thing. If you're making quick or rash decisions, you're more, your implicit bias is more likely to show. Individualization, make sure you're judging a person by their own characteristics and not by a group. Check your messaging. So when you're using words like, I don't see race, or I only hire the best people from my team, think about what that message that sends to everybody and try to use language that's more inclusive and that really embraces everyone's differences. Institutionalized fairness, and that kind of goes with the last slide, and take two. Like doing this now doesn't mean you've like learned it forever and you never have to think about this again. This should be like a constant learning for all of us. And so, so in conclusion, I think our future is really bright. I mean, we've had the first African-American woman be the named to chair academic surgery in the last few months. We've had really awesome leaders that some of you see on here. So we've got great examples, and we have young leaders that are coming up that are just fantastic. So in summary, I think our future is really going to be a bright one, and I look forward to seeing what that is over the rest of my career. Thanks.
We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about another important issue in in looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion it is looking at what happens to our patients and the racial disparities that exist in HPB diseases. And Dr. Maria Russell is going to present that. She is from Emory University.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I have no disclosures. So what is cancer disparities? These are any differences in cancer measures that put one group at a disadvantage against the other groups. And while today I'm going to talk a lot about racial and ethnic minority groups, it's almost impossible to separate these out from individuals of low socioeconomic status, individuals who lack or have limited health insurance, patients who live in different areas, whether that be different areas of the country or metropolitan versus rural areas, LGBTQ, and extremes of age can all have healthcare disparities. And why do these disparities exist? Well, it's a complex and interrelated factors between environmental factors such as air and water quality, behavior factors like tobacco and alcohol use, diet, obesity, social factors like education and income. Access to healthcare is really important. Cultural factors we'll talk a little bit about. And then of course, psychological, biologic, and genetic factors all go into these disparities. So I work spend about 50% of my time in a county hospital, and I want you to meet one of my patients. AJ was a 30-year-old male who was transferred actually to our tertiary referral center with obstructive jaundice and abdominal pain. And he was found on imaging to have a pancreatic head mass. He had 1 AHPBA with stent placement. The brushings for that were ultimately negative. His tumor markers were all normal, and he was discharged with recommendations to undergo an outpatient EUS with biopsy. And then he disappeared. And he came back to my safety net hospital 4 months later, complaining of abdominal pain and jaundice again from his obstructed stent. His imaging was stable, no evidence of metastatic disease. The pancreatic head mass had gotten a little bit larger, but not much. The underwent stent exchange and the EUS was suspicious for adenocarcinoma. This is what my patient looks like. And this is where he lives, except for on really good days when he actually has enough money to put in his car so that he can get air conditioning away from the heat of Atlanta. And this is a number of people in his life that he can depend on. So while we can focus on racial and ethnic disparities, it's almost impossible to separate them out from insurance, poverty, education, and social support that many of our other patients have. And now this young man is facing a deadly disease. So pancreas cancer, 60,000 cases in 2021 with nearly 50,000 deaths, a 5-year relative survival rate of 10%. When you look at the rate of new cancers and their death rate per 100,000 persons by race and ethnicity, what we find is that Black men and women have higher incidences of pancreas cancer. They also have a higher death rate from pancreas cancer per 100,000 patients. This is a study published in 2020 using the National Cancer Database, looking at unadjusted survival from diagnosis of pancreatic adenocarcinoma. And while the differences are not huge, it is statistically significant difference with white patients having a better overall survival than Black patients. The manuscripts further went in to look at age, stage of presentation, comorbidities, and treating facilities. And what you can see, Black patients presented as younger, at a younger age, with more advanced stages of disease, with more comorbidities. And in this study, which is a little bit unusual, they tended to get their care at academic health institutions, and all of these are statistically significant. When we break it down on treatments administered at each stage, outside of stage 1, if you were Black, you were less likely to get surgery, and you were less likely to get chemotherapy for both stage 2 and 3. And at stage 4 disease, when chemotherapy is usually the recommended treatment, you were less likely to get chemotherapy if you were Black as opposed to white, and all these are significant. So what they did next is broke down this into a multivariable hazard regression model. And for this, they looked at race and compared it to demographic and socioeconomic factors. And what we find is that Black race and older age had decreased overall survival in this multivariable model, whereas a higher level of income and higher education, getting treatment outside of a community health center, and having insurance were associated with improved overall survival. Next, they took race and put it against clinical factors. And what we found here is that if you actually take all the clinical factors into effect, Black race actually had better overall survival. And the things that were more important were, T stage, end stage, and treatment. This study looked at healthcare disparities and outcomes of patients with resectable pancreas cancer. And I like this because it puts Black patients and white patients in a column so that you can actually see. Black patients were less likely to have insurance. They were more likely, less likely to have any insurance, less likely to have private insurance, more likely to have comorbidities, more likely to be in the lowest median income quartile, more likely to live in areas where there were more people who did not get a high school degree, less likely to present with stage 1 and 2 disease, and more likely to present with stage 4 disease. When they took it and looked at multivariable analysis for patients who were not receiving the offered surgery, what we found is that Black race, increasing age, female sex, and Hispanic ethnicity were all associated with not receiving the offered surgery. And then finally, when we looked at patients who actually received surgery and they did a multivariable analysis on this, you find that Black race and female sex no longer are associated with inferior overall survival. And this study looked at disparities in stage-specific guideline concordant cancer-directed treatment for pancreatic adenocarcinoma. And looking at this, if you were female, if you were a race other than white, and if you had higher comorbidities, you were less likely to get guideline concordant care. Whereas more educated patients with higher incomes who had insurance were more likely to get guideline concordant care. And this is important because when they broke it down stage for stage, patients who received guideline concordant care had better overall survival. So in summary, pancreas cancer in Black patients presents at a younger age, more advanced stage. These patients are more likely to be socioeconomically disadvantaged, less likely to be offered or undergo surgery or chemotherapy, and more likely to have a worse overall survival. The other treatment that I want to look at is for hepatocellular cancer. So 40,000 new cases in 2021, 30,000 deaths, 5-year relative survival of 20%. Similar to pancreas cancer, when we break it down into rates of new cancer cases and death rate per 100,000 patients, race other than white and ethnicity, those patients are having a higher incidence of hepatocellular cancer. They also are dying at a higher rate than their white counterparts. This study was published out of Adam Yope's group out of UT Southwestern in Parkland, looking at unadjusted overall survival. And as you can see here, white patients had a median survival of 16 months, whereas Hispanic patients were less at 14, and Black patients were nearly 6 months inferior at only 10 months. And this was especially significant when they looked at overall survival and when they looked at BCLC stage D disease. When they did their multivariable analysis, they found that while Hispanic race was no longer associated with inferior overall survival, Black race still was, as was the advanced stage of disease and receiving treatment other than liver transplant. We did a similar study using the United States Safety Net Collaborative, and this was published by one of our residents, Dr. Rachel Lee. And our study was a little bit different, included a little bit different variables, but what we found is that while Black and Hispanic race were associated with inferior overall survivals on univariate analysis, when we took into account all these other factors, the race and ethnicity went away as statistically significant, and things like insurance, MELD, stage of presentation, and treatment other than transplant became more important. So in general, HCC patients are younger also at presentation, more advanced stage, more sociodemographically disadvantaged, and less likely to undergo curative intent treatment, which I'll show you in just a second, and more likely to have inferior adjusted survival. However, what we're finding is that in some studies, if we account for socioeconomic and clinical factors, survival differences may not be quite as dramatic, or they may actually go away. So one thing I want to point out is that, HCC, we actually have screening for HCC. So we know patients with cirrhosis are at increased risk of developing HCC. So there are some areas where we can make improvements. So what about if we take patients who have cirrhosis at risk of HCC? We know from this study, also published by Dr. Lee, that if alcohol is one of the etiologies for your cirrhosis, you have an inferior overall survival. So what about if we work with primary care doctors to actually get these patients into treatment? We also know that if you have HCC due to HCV, which most of the patients in the United States have, and especially at safety net hospitals, if you get treatment for your HCV, your overall survival is also improved, as is your recurrence-free survival. So we need to remember to get our HCV patients their DAA so that they can have an SVR and have a better overall survival. Looking at screening, this is a study published in 2017 Patients who undergo surveillance have a higher likelihood of being diagnosed at an earlier stage. They also tend to get treatment, whereas if you're not in surveillance, you may get no treatment. And this obviously translates into a better overall survival. Next, timely diagnosis and staging, as well as multidisciplinary discussion, is really important for these patients. This was what Grady looked like before they had a surgical oncologist. 60% of patients with HCC were not getting treated, and over 20% were presenting with stage 4 disease. We established a disease management team and increased our referrals to people who could actually make an impact on this disease, and it translated into an improved overall survival. And then finally, timely referral and receipt of appropriate HCC therapies. So this study, which was published in 2016, shows that Black patients are more likely to be diagnosed with distant disease, less likely to be diagnosed with Milan criteria. And when looking at treatment stratified by stage at diagnosis, if you were Hispanic or Black, you had less likelihood of getting any treatment. And if you did get treatment, it was less likely to be curative intent. And if you happen to make it onto the transplant list, what we found is that Black patients were almost twice as likely to die on the transplant list. And if you were Hispanic or Asian, you had about half the chance of your white counterparts of being transplanted within 360 days. So I think I've proven that racial disparities exist in the outcomes of our HPV patients. These are often bundled with disparities in income, education, insurance, access to care, as well as advanced stage of presentation and lack of receipt of guideline concordant care. So where do we go from here? So we recognize that cancer health disparities exist, and they exist within this non-modifiable confine of race. And so if you consider this your circle of influence, which I really liked the reference yesterday, what can we do to impact our patients? We look at social education and income. Dr. Vickers gave a brilliant talk yesterday talking about impacting health education. We need to get into our schools and get our children educated, job training to break the cycle of poverty, and outreach programs to get minority students interested in science, technology, math, medicine. And these are things that we can do. We do not have universal health care in this country, but we can focus on getting guideline concordant care. We need to recruit minority patients to trials so that we know more about how minorities are affected by the drugs that we're using and the treatments we're giving. And we need to pay attention to adherence to screening guidelines. For behavioral, we need to refer patients for lifestyle treatment programs, smoking cessation, alcohol treatment, nutrition and education. Please do not underestimate the cultural health beliefs that exist. I'm told every day in clinic that cancer is spread by air, and that's why patients don't want surgery. We really need to work on increasing the diversity in our workforce. We need to have lay navigators and patient advocates who may share the same cultural and health beliefs that our patients do, and it can help decrease mistrust in our healthcare system. Psychologically, we need to work on getting patients to stress tools and getting them referred to social workers, counselors, and clergy who can help. And finally, we need to ask our patients about where they live. Is it safe for them to go for walks outside? And we need to look at grants for bus passes, free parking, and childcare to help get these vulnerable patients in for their screening and for their treatment. Thanks again for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Dr. Russell, for an excellent talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Patrick Worth, and who is going to be speaking on assessing and addressing LGBTQ representation in HPV surgery.
Oh no.
I think we're out of order in terms of the slide.
Unless Dr. Roger wants to go.
We're looking for slides for
It was
Dr. Patrick Worth.
174 or something. Good morning. I'm Patrick Worth. I'm an assistant professor of surgery at OHSU. There we go. And I'd just like to thank the organizers, Dr. Clark, Dr. Mather, Dr. Pollack, for prioritizing DEI in HPV surgery and for organizing this committee and having me here today. I'm going to be talking about LGBTQ representation in academic surgery generally is what I normally talk about with this talk, and then kind of more specifically HPV surgery. we have a lot of work to do. I don't have any financial disclosures, but I think seeing a couple past presidents of the AHPBA here too is indication that this is a priority. And I appreciate that Dr. Pollack has also prioritized this issue. And I think one of the important things to remember is that intersectionality is key. Whenever I give this talk, I like to say that I don't want to take any oxygen from the fire. I want to help contribute to what we're doing in DEI and promoting some of this work. These opinions are my own. I'm happy to correspond about this. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of DEI language is appropriated, and that, you know, as we're doing this work and as we're moving forward, that we have to be mindful of that. And this is not a primer. I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. I don't represent it. So my goals today are to advocate for and support underrepresented persons in surgery. I think in understanding where LGBTQ representation lies, we can also promote racial justice, gender equity, and diversity for all levels of trainees and staff, and help develop the next generation of surgeons. I also think in referencing the last talk that improving surgical care for underrepresented patients is an important part of this work, and to educate and transform our next generation, and also importantly to add depth to the literature. And I'm going to go over some of the work that's been published. It's paltry, and I think one of my goals personally is to kind of improve and advance this work. So I grew up in Eastern Connecticut. I'm a cis white male. I have enjoyed relative privilege in my life, but I went from rural Connecticut to NYU. And the reason that I give you some of this background is that, like many people who work in DEI, becoming a surgeon always felt a little bit out of reach because I was gay. And I think that it's important to remember that as we're trying to promote a new generation of trainees and HPB surgeons, that this spans a lot of domains. I was interned as a college student at Windham Hospital, where I was told by many faculty that being gay and being a surgeon was anathema. But I ended up attending Brown as a medical student, where the culture was a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more welcoming. And this is actually from a Brown Medicine magazine, the year that I matriculated, and some colleagues of mine that I worked with at Brown to help develop a sex gender minority curriculum there. And so I think we did a lot of work, and a lot of my early work was kind of being open and advocating for this population. I'll kind of skip through some of this quickly, just in the interest of time. I moved west to OHSU because the culture and the climate and the surgeons there were very welcoming and inclusive. And I think that had a large impact on my ability to even be here today and talk about sexual and gender minorities in academic medicine. And I have the support of a great partner, and we have a little girl who's just a real joy and makes all this work kind of worth it. So in evaluating LGBTQ representation in academic surgery, I think it's really important that Dr. Clark and others are doing a lot of really vocal and groundbreaking work in making sure that this is a priority at the committee level on a lot of these societies, including the AAS, the AHPBA. I recently spoke at the Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery Committee's annual meeting. So I think that the momentum surrounding sexual and gender minorities in surgery is increasing, and I think that it's important that we all kind of support all domains of gender equity, diversity as we advance in surgery. So that last slide was from the AAS webinar from, I think that was early 2002 that we did that talk. And I was asked to speak on LGBTQ representation in academic surgery. And I started with a simple mesh heading search. And basically what I found in doing this was that there was a reasonable amount of data when it came to overlap between sexual behavior as a mesh topic and physicians, but when you change that heading to surgeons, there's a huge drop off. And a lot of these papers are actually centered around patients who are sexual and gender minorities, not surgeons themselves, which I think is critically important. And we'll kind of get to that in a minute. You see when sexuality and physicians versus sexuality and surgeons are searched, the search results drop off dramatically. Sexual and gender minorities and spouses, which I think is also telling that we aren't doing a lot of work understanding the importance of these domains for surgeons. And I think that's critical. So I dove a little bit into how these DEI topics are represented at society level and looked at this kind of word jumble of groups on the bottom of the slide here. This is 21 different surgical societies. These are regional and specialty societies. And we looked at whether or not there was a mention in bylaws, in foundational documents, of any kind of DEI topics. And this was a broad array of topics, including gender equity, racial and ethnic diversity, sexual and gender minorities, and found that in foundational documents far and away, there was about 46% of groups had some kind of representation or some kind of mention. Only 7% had a mention on the main page, and this was actually the AAS almost solely. Representation or advocacy in any search documentation within the website. Only about a quarter had any subgroup or committee on diversity and inclusion. And actually over the last year that has increased. We're actually looking at this data again. It's been about a year and a half since we aggregated this data. Only about an eighth had any programming at annual conferences, and that's also increased. And then about 55% had no mention of LGBTQ persons, sexual and gender minorities in any of their documentation. And so we're repeating this analysis because there's been a change over the last year, which I think is interesting in and of itself, and putting this together, hopefully to publish soon. Really the best work that's been done on the experience of LGBTQ persons in surgery was from an ABSITE survey. I think this was on the 2019 ABSITE. And at the end of the several hour exam, 6,500 respondents responded in terms of gender, sexuality, identification. And this was meant to look at rates of bullying, harassment, discrimination as self-reported by residents. And this is actually, I just talked to Julianne Sosa at UCSF, and she's been working on this. I think this is in review right now, I believe, if not, it's been published. But basically, you see that of sexual and gender minorities, 75% reported some type of bullying, almost half reported some degree of sexual harassment, and almost 60% some form of discrimination. And then from attendings, which I think is important as self-reported, almost half felt that this was coming from attendings as opposed to their peers or colleagues. A third had experienced some sexual harassment or discrimination from attendings as well. And why this is critically important for us is, I'll draw your attention to the bottom two rows of this data. Overall, there was no real significant difference in terms of appreciation of work by attendings, co-residents, cooperation, having friends within the program. But the critical thing here is that sexual and gender minorities reported almost double rates of considering leaving their program. So when we're thinking about attrition, when we're thinking about experience of residents within these programs and having people be successful through training, this is one thing to consider. And then especially important for me and anecdotally, something that we've experienced at OHSU over the last decade. I think there have been 2 suicides in various programs of sexual and gender minority residents. There's almost a double rate of suicidal thoughts. And so this is critical work and critical to understand. These are a few of the other studies that exist on sexual and gender minorities in healthcare, in surgery, and healthcare medicine broadly for trainees. And a lot of the work has been done on trainees because at the institutional and society levels, we don't have good data on reporting this. And so it becomes a challenging thing to kind of study because it's not something that's frequently asked or aggregated, and and that's problematic and a whole talk in and of itself as to how we're able to kind of collect and understand this data. I think one of the important things here is that when you consider the ABSITE study that I showed in the last two slides, about 5% of surgical residents identified as some type of sexual or gender minority. And that's much lower than rates of sex gender minorities identified in some of these other studies, which more closely approximates population levels of about a little bit less than 10%, which is kind of the current level. So we're also not recruiting sexual and gender minorities, and that's not a monolith in and of itself. I mean, there's frequently a lot of overlap between gender, between race and ethnic groups and different domains. And so I think it's, as my friend Jen Pasco said in the Women in Surgery discussion yesterday, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I like this study. This is a survey of sexual and gender minorities and their choices in specialties in medicine. And there's a negative correlation between what the perception of the prestige of a field is, and this doesn't go into kind of granularity with respect to oncology or HPB surgery or things like that, but general surgery is considered to be in this a higher prestige field and less inclusive. It's kind of in this lower half here, but there's a negative correlation between prestige and the likelihood of sexual and gender minorities to feel welcomed or able to pursue a field like that. And that has a lot to do with role models in the specialty, options for fellowship, and then considerations that cross many domains like work-life balance, fit with personality, interests and skills, the content of specialty, and also in this study was reported race and ethnicity and sexual orientation. So this has a lot of relevance for our patients. Sexual and gender minority patients experience a lot of depression, anxiety, trauma. In the surgical fields, and this, when I give this talk for kind of other groups, we consider obesity, gender confirmation surgery. In terms of our own surgical outcomes, there are higher rates of tobacco use, alcohol use, and different issues with compliance and acceptance. Concordance is especially important for patients. This is a study actually out of the orthopedic literature that showed that patients prefer surgeons that they identify with in whatever domains. And there's a lot of good literature for this in for racial and ethnic minorities, for gender concordance between specialists. And so I've made the choice, and I have the privilege to be able to kind of live openly as a surgeon. I'm out on my academic pages and things like that, but that's something that's not available to a lot of people. So this is critical for our trainees, critical for our faculty. It's critical for our patients that we have sexual and gender minority representation in surgery. And so we've been developing some research on this. We essentially began by scraping general surgery training program websites and used a HTML, XML scraping program that I wrote in R, and we were able to take a list of general surgery training programs and take language from those pages and do kind of word association to determine the prevalence of this kind of language in general surgical program websites. And we have attempted to do this with complex general surgical oncology pages, and also with the Fellowship Council AHPBA pages, which are a little bit less descriptive or less developed and kind of more difficult to access. But I'll show you what we found from the general surgical training programs. And just to clarify, this work is ongoing as well. So we're still working on this, but we felt that this was important because especially in a pandemic where people are interviewing remotely, are not able to visit these sites, for underrepresented persons of all domains, this is a real negative, has negative impact. And so overall, only 13%, 14% of programs mention diversity on their page. The word diverse came up in most cases with respect to kind of their surgical experience and not with respect to persons. So this is one of kind of the interesting things that comes from this kind of website scraping. Inclusivity, inclusive language. I mean, the percentages are very low for any of these words coming up on these training program websites. You know, I think the highest was gender at about 20, oh, I'm sorry, no, diverse at 30%, which we talked about. So there were no real differences across regions or across the language use, which I was happy to learn. We evaluated different groups based on New England, Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, South, Midwest, Mountain region. The ability for this method to kind of go into, you know, videos or different formats on web pages was limited. And we're actually working, now that we've kind of gotten this program functioning and being able to obtain a list of these websites, we're looking at comparing this across specialties as well. So comparing general surgery to internal medicine, family medicine, different training program websites. So hopefully we'll be presenting some more of this data soon, but there's just a little taste. So I don't want to take up any more of our time here, but I appreciate the invitation. And I appreciate the commitment from the AHPB leadership to this topic, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Rohan Jayaraja, who is going to be speaking about diversity and training in HPB surgery across the organizations that support us in our charge.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mather and Dr. Clark, for inviting me to this, and to Dr. Pollock for making this an important effort of the AHPBA. We really appreciate it. First of all, some disclosures. I'm a consultant for these companies, and as I said yesterday, I'm open to any more if anyone's out there. But they don't affect this talk, obviously. Just an overview of this talk, and it's going to be brief. I spoke to Dr. Clark, and she was kind enough to help me craft how to present this, because diversity and training seemed a little bit of an interesting mix for me, but it was very helpful and actually really helped me understand quite a lot. So a couple of words about my personal story, and then talk a little bit about data around, requirements for each track of training. And then really a little bit of thought about what the future holds and my personal advice. Dr. Dilloff, to talk about data. The older I get, the less data I have. It's really interesting. And so just a little bit about my personal story. I'm from Sri Lanka, grew up in Africa, went to school in England. So I always use the analogy of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. It's a great move west. Went to the University of Chicago, actually shared going to Brown with Patrick here. Loved it. It was so accepting, and we were displaying pink triangles and then having Christian marches on the lawn, like one after the other. So everyone was included. University of Chicago, then I did my 1 year of a transplant fellowship, and to quote Eddie Abdallah, I feel like I'm a recovering transplanter. still. Then I joined the Department of Surgery at UT Southwestern and talk about disparity there. You know, a South Asian guy who talks funny, who wears really bright colors in Texas, who is partially transplant trained and, you know, was gonna make my kids' soccer games. And so that wasn't especially easy at the time, but loved it. Was very lucky, Marty, to be at a safety net hospital. It was one of the greatest things of my life. And I always said one of the greatest secrets in Dallas, because old Parkland was connected to the private hospital by a walkway, was that the guy that lived under the bridge and the person that owned Neiman Marcus got the same doctor. It was amazing. Now, the corollary to that was one of my colleagues told me that it took as much work to take care of one of those high-level patients as it did to take care of a whole service at Parkland. And that really bothered me because that was not me. I was going to round on each of those patients every day on both sides of that divide. I then sort of, for a lot of reasons, one was that I realized I was sort of a private practitioner in the academic world and struggled, especially with research in the basic science arena. Went into private practice in 2005, and that was also a difficult thing. To be an academician in my mind in the private world was really a challenge. So there was, you know, disparity there. And then, you know, I moved to our current location at Methodist Richardson, and some of that was around some struggles too, with not necessarily fitting in some of the culture. So I'm going to bare my soul a little bit today. You know, I'm partially trained transplant. I have an HPB fellowship and I practice, you know, Dr. Jackson can tell you the clinic is a lot of surg-onc because we see everything from esophagus to rectal cancer. And so I kind of call myself the roadmap to peace because I really, really feel strongly about each of these areas. And so just to talk about training in HPB, I think we have three really outstanding ways to train. The transplant way, which I understand, I did part of that. The SSO way, which I aspire to, because I didn't do it, but I have so much admiration for my colleagues that did, and the AHPBA route, which clearly I believe in because I have a fellowship that is in that way. So how do we understand this? So just to go through some of the factual information first before I get into my thoughts. The ASTS pathway separates HB and HPB and is embedded within the liver transplant fellowship. There is an independent entity that is outside of the ASTS that accredits these programs. And I think this is really nice to have separation of the three sites of government, you know, executive, legislative, and judicial, and have that accrediting body be outside. So just to give you an example, when we set that up for the AHPBA, we made the legislative branch the Education and Training Committee. The branch that executes this is the Program Directors Committee, and the Fellowship Council is the judicial branch. So that's really nice because you don't have the inmates running the asylum. You have somebody who's separated coming up with the content. This is a hard slide to read, but basically these are the programmatic requirements for the HB and HVB, and I would send you to the paper that was recently published in JOGS where Tim Pollock is the senior author on this, looking at these modes, so please do look at this. But this is a little bit easier to look at the individual requirements with regard to transplant, multi-organ procurement, and then hepatobiliary requirements and HPB requirements, and these are yearly requirements. The SSO pathway is a two-year pathway. It's ACGME recognized now, focuses on the management of cancer and is really multidisciplinary. And this is something we can really learn about, you know, looking at all facets of the care of the cancer patient. And this was kind of the 1981 version and now the 2011 version where, you know, education, basic science, clinical trials, community outreach, leadership, etc. And I want to thank Russ Berman for these tables. These are the requirements. And again, there's a multi-D requirement too. In the HPB arena, You can see that the minimum case number is 35. Again, many programs meet much greater requirement. But the idea here is, really benefit from the multidisciplinary nature to the patient and learn about also not just operations, but non-operative care. Finally, the HPB pathway that's sponsored through this society, a little over 50% of the programs are 2 years now, accredited through the Fellowship Council, and we've now gone international to South America, which is amazing. And a lot of detail over here, a lot more granularity to each of these areas, liver, pancreas, bile duct. Just to talk about what we have now, 100 total cases, 25 livers, of which 20 need to be hemolivers, pancreas 25, of which 20 need to be Whipples. We've included ultrasound ablation and MIS now. So to switch gears, what do we mean by diversity in training, right? So we can see that there's a different emphasis on each pathway. We can see that the product is different. And the question is this okay? Well, I actually think, let's look at implicit bias, right? And this is just one definition, a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally that nevertheless affects judgment, decisions, and behaviors. And I want to just take this opportunity to stop for a minute and think about how we have been socializing at this meeting. Have we been gravitating towards those that trained like us? Have all of the folks from major institutions sat together and had a dinner together? Why can't we reach across and see what's good in somebody else? In fact, embrace it. So we need to face the facts, right? We favor those who look like us, who train like us. We always default to those situations, especially in circumstances of stress. I walked into the, this is very personal, but it was really interesting because those of you that know me, I'm really have no trouble talking, right? But I get really stressed when I'm walking into a room, and even if I know people. And just to be very personal, I got really stressed walking at the presidential dinner the other day because I didn't know which table to sit at. And I felt a little bit like I was in high school again, and I was the kid that nobody really wanted to sit with. And that was me. That was not anyone else around me, but that was my perception of how I felt. And I just think it's really please reach out to that person because you don't know what's going on in their mind or in their life. And can you imagine if you don't look like the rest of the people around you, or if you don't feel like you belong because you were never really comfortable with eating with a fork and knife in a certain way? Because I was taught to eat with my fingers. And sure, I can eat with a fork and knife, and I know how to do that, but it just think about those things as you approach somebody. Just approach the differences that we have. This is what I would love to remember, and this is my advice to everyone that's getting married. Wake up every morning knowing that you, not them, are the luckiest person in the world. It will make for the best marriage in the world because we think we're all that, right? Everything around us supports that, right? The OR can't start without you. But you know what? You're so lucky to be married or, with that person that's lying right next to you, and how much they do for you to allow you to do these things. So why can't we see what's good in other people and the way that they're trained? So, let's face the elephant in the room. Some people think that transplant is a technical feat. Some people think that surgical oncologists give a lot of chemotherapy. Some people think that the HPB route does not prepare you for academic medicine. Why can't we turn that around and say, gosh, I wish I could have Will Chapman teach me how to sew in a portal vein because he does that every day. And I struggle. I do struggle with that. I struggle. I wish I knew the data. We have a Serge Onk fellow now who's come into our program. Man, I can't quote trials because I forget my kids' names if I remember the name of a trial. I've only got so much in my brain. And let's try to be investigational outside of the ivory tower. Suzanne's leading an effort that I think is going to be great to, to really get us all together and teach us how to do this. So I just want to say, like, this is my ideal team, right? I just want us all to work together, and even if it's not at one institution, across the aisle. So we talk about politics and we talk about how in DC people don't reach across the aisle. Let's all reach across the aisle. Go up to somebody that didn't train like you and say hello. How can I help you? How can I help you? And for those of you that were just trainees or are trainees, pay it forward, because you got to this place because somebody took a chance on you and somebody helped you get to this point. I also want to talk about the power of the other. So while we talk about HPB, remember that there's an other to our lives, right? And Tim, I really want to write this as a follow-up to our paper. Here's HPB. Well, what's the power of the other that we do? And I tell our trainees this as they're trying to think about tracks. Do you like the other part of your practice to be GI oncology or melanoma? Do you like the other part of your practice to be transplant or vascular? Do you like the other part of your practice in HPB to be general surgery? I think that helps people hire folks because they understand what the other would be. And second of all, I think that helps the trainees understand, because few of us go into a left pancreatectomy practice, right? Dallas, right? We've got amazing people just around the corner from me. I do everything. So I love the general surgery aspect too. So the power of the other. So overall, let's recognize our differences. That's the first thing. Let's appreciate our differences and let's learn from our differences. I want to learn from each and every one of you. And it's very deep, obviously, because I'm bearing some very personal things here. But I always remember this. Robert McClelland was my mentor at UT Southwestern. And he says, the day I stop learning is the day I hope I roll over and die. Rest in peace, Robert. He was the last person alive who had attended JFK. And it has some very interesting stories, by the way, about that. But he passed away 2 years ago now, and he never stopped learning. Those of you that grew up in my generation, he was the editor of selected readings. So I just want to thank you all. This is my family, the most important part of my life. And we got a glimpse of Tim's family the other day and could see what has made him. So in the same way, my wife and my family has made me. Thank you so much for listening to my rambling. I really appreciate it.
Our next speaker, thank you, Dr. Raja, very personal and compelling talk. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Kimberly Washington from OHSU, and who is going to talk about, so where do we go from here?
Great. Again, Kim Washington, OHSU, one of the fellows. That's the part he didn't mention. First off, I want to thank Dr. Pollock for allowing me to present on the accomplishments of the DEI committee this year. Also, Dr. Clark, who invited me to join the DEI committee over the course of this year. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to diversity and inclusion. These DEI committees are popping up everywhere, offering opportunities for minorities and women to participate at the highest level of organizations. Diversity is largely simple to achieve. Just accept more people and voila, you have diversity. But inclusion, on the other hand, requires more intentionality. Diversity places people at the table, whereas inclusion gives them voices. Their voices, their opinions, and their perspectives value once at the table. The committee's mission is to increase diversity and ensure inclusion in an intentional way through policy and programming for our society. The following sets of slides will exemplify what we have done towards that goal. Through our collaboration with the membership committee, a DEI survey will be sent to our membership. Within the membership survey, there will be certain questions in which participants are can respond regarding their opinion about representation within this society, issues related to identity and inclusion. Transparency in our experiences can be enlightening to the society leadership and foster initiatives to affect change amongst the culture of our organization. We encourage all members to participate. During this year's AHPBA meeting, the Executive Council will decide on our participation in partnership with the National Pancreas Foundation and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. The intent of this initiative is to educate, engage, and increase awareness of pancreatic cancer in the African-American community. As we've seen in previous presentations, there's there's worse outcomes for African-Americans with pancreatic cancer. The incidence as well is higher, 14.8 per 100,000 of African-American men have pancreatic cancer, as compared to 8.8 per 100,000 of the general population. So education and awareness is essential to improving outcomes in our community. Additionally, the DEI committee initiated a CB clinic about 2 weeks ago, advertised to senior residents who were interested in HPB fellowship. In this clinic, senior residents were connected with AHPBA members who reviewed their CV and provided critiques to improve content and presentation. There were 22 resident participants representing 17 institutions. The initiative was well received by interested residents. The feedback was excellent. At least 15 residents who attended reached out directly to the DEI committee chair about the CV clinic with positive feedback. The attendees will receive a quick survey to provide written feedback to gain more information on their experience and identify ways to improve for subsequent CV clinics. The DEI committee and the AHPBA awarded travel grants to underrepresented minorities who had an interest in attending this meeting. There were 7 extremely competitive applicants, and due to the generosity of the AHPBA Executive Council and the high quality of applicants we received, we were able to award all 7 applicants with the travel grant. These are the 7 awardees. So if you see them around, act like you know them. And we welcome them to our association, and congratulations on receiving the grant. Other initiatives include during Women's History Month, as you guys received in your email, the AHPBA Digest highlighted several HPV heroines who have made an impact on other members of the society. Of note, these people were not self-nominated. Others actually nominated them with very kind words. I put a little tear to my eye when I read mine. So that was Women's History Month in March. You'll be seeing that each year. The next was in May in celebration of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, in which the AHPBA Digest also highlighted some of our colleagues in that ethnic group. As well, these were not self-nominated, and it's sometimes really great to hear what your colleagues think about you, because rarely do we offer that information vocally. And so this gives you an opportunity to hear what others think about you. Similarly, in alignment with our LGBTQ members, the HPBA logo was adjusted on our social media networks in the month of June in support and inclusivity of the LGBTQ community. With guidance of our LGBTQ members, we will be ramping up our efforts over the coming year. The future of the DEI committee, which is where I'll park for a bit, it's pretty bright. There are a few things that we're intending to do over the course of the next year. There'll be more things that will come up for sure as we continue to find new initiatives in order to move forward our goals. As stated at the beginning of this talk, the DEI committees are popping up everywhere in response to recent events that have placed issues of racial inequity and lack of representation at the forefront of the minds of the majority. A lot of these efforts, unfortunately, will likely be performative. And I hate to say that, but it's just true. But we want our DEI committee to not be performative, but that our actions be intentional to make changes within our society, our institutions, and our subspecialty. We intend to gather data from the DEI survey to guide in our efforts for producing change in our society. Likewise, the DEI committee intends to effect change in the pipeline of underrepresented minorities into the field of HPB surgery. Whether the issue is the lack of a pipeline, a leaky pipeline, or a true blockage in the pipe, we intend to improve diversity within the field of HPB surgery. AHPBA sanctioned events will be organized and implemented in order to promote DEI efforts. Some such efforts which are currently being developed include a creation of an applicant toolkit in an effort to provide guidance for URM members. Lack of mentorship is commonplace amongst URM residents. And I can speak from my own experience that many URM residents aren't approached by faculty for mentorship and research initiatives. Many don't know where to begin, who to ask, or how to ask. As a society, we can impact these residents. Additionally, we will create a database for research positions so that interested residents have a resource, especially those residents who are not being trained in large academic institutions, but have an interest in basic science or clinical or translational research. So how can you get involved? Volunteer with the DEI committee. There are many initiatives coming in the near future, such as the recent CV clinic in which we call for volunteers. Sign up, make the time. But also, inclusion starts at the individual level. Take stock of those who are closest to you professionally. How diverse is your circle? If you're in a position of influence in hiring practices at your institution, how have you and how can you impact hiring? Approach and pursue URM trainees. You'll be amazed at the response you receive by just reaching out, because that is not the usual. Mentor, advocate, and promote your URM junior faculty. Get people to a higher level in their current position, and you will see the response that you get. This is our committee and the members of our committee who have come up with all these wonderful ideas and have implemented these things. You're meeting a few of them on this podium and all of their contributions, but there's a large group behind us that works with us in order to make these things happen. We really hope that this isn't, as Dr. Pollack was concerned about, a 1 year or 2 year initiative, but this is something that we make a part of AHPBA for the foreseeable future. Again, thank you, Dr. Pollack. Thank you, Dr. Clark. And next up will be our speaker related to the involvement of APPs in this initiative as well.
So our final speaker before the discussion is going to be Melissa Arvide from MD Anderson, who's going to be talking about incorporating who I think are some of the most unsung heroes and heroines in HPB work, which is our allied health staff and allied health partners.
Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. So I was asked to talk about incorporating allied health partners in AHPBA. So I hope in the next couple of minutes, I will be able to accomplish the following, which is to define what is an advanced practice provider or an APP, what is our role and how to incorporate us as a key member of your team. I'm going to very briefly discuss our demographics compared to that of the US population, and then briefly touch about how to build a culturally competent team involving us as APPs. So what is an APP? An APP is an advanced practice provider. We are medical providers, and we commonly fall into two different categories: nurse practitioners or physician assistants, both of which require higher degrees of education, usually in the form of a master's degree and sometimes a doctorate degree. Either way, we work in all areas of the hospital, and we can assist with different procedures. We most often work in collaboration with a supervising physician, although the autonomy of the APP is usually dependent on the supervising physician's practice. We help fill the need for increased providers, and we try to bridge that gap in healthcare. More importantly, though, we also have that flexibility to spend extra time with our patients. And therefore, it is important that we also be an extension of your commitment and your practice to your patients. So a survey conducted by the NCCPA, which is our certifying organization for physician assistants, asked PAs around the country, what was their main service provided in their practice? And as you can see, we're very clinically involved. If you look at number 3, for example, you can see that we have the privilege of spending an extraordinary amount of time with our patients. And like I said, as an extension of that practice, we're in this unique position to really make an impact. And we are given the responsibility to be culturally sensitive, as this leads to increased compliance and adherence to therapies. So let's start by highlighting some of the benefits of having an APP in the outpatient setting of your HPB practice. In a busy clinical practice, having an APP might mean that you can work in tandem to see more patients. Depending on the disease site, some APPs can have greater autonomy. They can have their own surveillance or survivorship clinic. This is a way that you can try to offload a percentage of your patients that still need follow-ups, but it also frees your time to focus on your more complex patients. APPs play a huge part in the preoperative screening of patients, clinic preps to make your clinics more efficient, peer-to-peer reviews are essential for both coordination of care, following up on their labs, their path reports, and the conclusions of your multidisciplinary conferences. Lastly, APPs can also help identify patients that might qualify for either your clinical or research trials that you're involved in. So these are all opportunities in which APPs can be, as I mentioned, an extension of your practice. As an inpatient APP, we are early rescuers. We can identify the need for early interventions to avoid or minimize complications. And our role was in part in response to the ACME workforce restrictions of surgical trainees. The successful integration of inpatient surgical APPs has resulted in the improvement of overall patient care and satisfaction. As inpatient APPs, we take care of the patients while our trainees and our surgeons are busy in the OR, the clinic, or other administrative tasks. And having a dedicated APP is helpful in the continuation of care as trainees come and rotate through our services. As an inpatient PA myself, I feel honored to become a part of my patient and their families' lives. And usually it's a brief encounter, but it's a time of their lives where they are the most vulnerable. And they really benefit from that extra attention and explanations. And so I do feel that we're also educators, not just to our patients, but also to our nursing staff, our support staff, and even our trainees, because all these increase compliance. And lastly, having a dedicated APP competent in caring for HPB surgery patients facilitates opportunities for quality improvement initiatives. Some institutions also use APPs in addition to surgical trainees, and that helps improve operative quality and efficiency. A qualitative survey was sent to rotating surgical fellows at my institution to focus on the perceived benefit of having an APP in the operating room. And what they found was a unanimously positive result of improving efficiency, educational benefits, and actually increased operative autonomy. In addition, with the increasing efforts to perform more MIS procedures, institutions are constantly using APPs in robotic cases as bedside assist in order to enhance the trainee's experience on the console. So now that I've presented the multiple roles that APPs can take on as part of your team, I'd like to point out our current demographics. Previous studies show that patients report better outcomes and increased trust when they're able to identify similarities with their providers, usually by race, background, or socioeconomic status, as we've discussed today. This is a compilation of the demographics taken from the US Census, the AHPBA, and a nurse practitioner website. And as you can see, we're not immune to the same shortcomings of other medical professionals, and we still have a lot of work to do. But what I do want to point out is that just as the quality of patient care for underrepresented minority patients rests on concurrence, so too does the student recruitment into these accredited programs, master's or doctorate programs. And when a program boasts a diverse faculty, there's a notable link to being able to recruit, support, retain, and graduate a diverse student body. which is part of our mission here too. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about something that I think is very important. As part of your care team, as an APP, we are equally asked to be culturally aware. And as I was doing some research for this talk, I came across this tool. It's called the Looking Glass Examination. And this really spoke to me, and I'd like to share it with you. To possess cultural awareness, we must have knowledge of our own thoughts and feelings and have appreciation for the diversity of others. So here's just one of the questions. The Looking Glass Examination is a series of 8 questions. They are true and false. And at the end of the questions, you kind of add up your scores and you're able to self-reflect and see where you stand and where you are as a provider and how you want to move forward. So you might be asking yourself, well, why is this important? Given that the population that we serve does not always match with the providers, it's important to be aware of what our patient population is composed of and how we can build a team together to best serve them. We're all too familiar with different language barriers. And although technology has really helped us, the ability to build rapport and obtain a good history is imperative for patient care. And there's a bunch of culture nuances, too many to go into, I've just listed 2. But again, because we have this opportunity to spend time with our patients, we can pick up on these nuances. Some cultures feel that questioning the doctor is questioning authority. And so that can lead to misunderstanding and non-compliance. So what can we do? Incorporate APPs into your practice. Build your team to reflect your mission. Reflect. Start with your own personal reflection of how you want to approach patient care. And reach out to help break some of those barriers. So in conclusion, I hope I've helped make a case for why APPs can play a vital role in your team. And as such, I'd like to encourage you to invite them and be involved in AHPBA and attend alongside with you next year. We have an APP symposium every year where we connect and we network with other HPB APPs around our country. As APPs currently make up only 4% of AHPB membership, I think there's potential for growth to incorporate us to be allied health partners in AHPBA. Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you to all of our panelists, and I got to tell you, I'm not sure that I was as specific as I should have been about what I hope to achieve today, but you guys really all knocked it completely out of the ballpark. And I hope this really generated some thoughts about where we go as an organization. We probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions or comments. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your talks. I loved every one of them. This means so much to me. Recently, we surveyed our graduates and faculty and found that in the past 5 years, we've had 0 DO candidates, and among faculty in position of power of selection, we had 0 faculty from that school. Is this something that's considered as part of our diversity goals, and are we taking any steps to improve on this?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. You know, it's not something that we focused on today, but I think going back to preparedness is actually really important. And I think that's the point of the CV clinic, which will be expanding next year to sort of a half day sort of an experience that hopefully like a part of a pre-meeting. I do think that the challenge for a lot of DO candidates are very similar, right? So lack of mentorship, lack of exposure, limited research opportunities, and also limited clinical opportunities. And our hope is to sort of use the AHPBA as a place where if somebody is really interested in HPB, regardless of how they trained, where they trained, and what training track they intend to go into, that we'll be able to provide opportunities for maybe clinical rotations that might be beneficial, research opportunities that might be beneficial, and then just taking away this sort of hidden curriculum that's basically served many of us for a long time, and really making sure that everybody who wants to enter the field sort of understands that. I think what's going to be key is making sure that people get involved early. It's a lot harder to get a chief resident up to competitive for a fellowship track if they really have major deficits. And so our goal is that we can get second-year residents, third-year residents sort of plugged into HPBA, and each year sort of assess what their competitiveness is for matching, or their preparedness is for matching in a fellowship, and seeing if we can help in any way. We will definitely be, and so that was a blind spot for me. We sort of talked about creating a listserv of program directors from general surgical residencies, and I will make sure that we include the DO programs as well. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
Dr. Warner.
I'll be brief. So thank you, first of all, for this session. This was amazing. All of you did an amazing job, and I think I've learned something. I hope everybody else has as well. I've also previously publicly thanked Dr. Jayaraja, but I want to do it again. Dr. Jayaraja, you provide a home for people here who don't otherwise feel welcome. You were the first person who spoke to me in leadership outside of anybody connecting me to you. And that meant the world to me as a resident in 2009. It kept me coming back to this meeting. And that is the type of inclusivity that we need, that absolute intangible of this society that keeps people coming back. So thank you for that. And thank you for encouraging other people to do it. My last question / comment is more of a plea. You know, we talked about not being performative with this, but actions speak louder than words. And this session is at 8 a.m. opposed by other things the day after the gala. How can we make sure that we have primetime billing that is unopposed, so that this room is full next year? That's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good comment. I think so. One of the things is, yes, much more work to be done from that standpoint, but also integrating DEI throughout this meeting really helped. So we got it in somehow to everyone at some point during the meeting, right? Whether it was this morning or it was yesterday or it was in the presidential address. And I think that's going to be really critical, because even if we will never be able to get everyone in one room all at the same time. And so I think making this something that is a persistent theme is a major goal of ours. But I do agree that we need to be a little bit more intentional about our programming to try to maximize exposure. Oh.
I had one question for our panelists, which is, and each of you spoke on and alluded to kind of pipeline issues for different groups and also for patients. So how do we best address the pipeline early? And Dr. Vickers kind of talked a little bit about this yesterday. I was interested in your thoughts on how do we, as an organization, address the pipeline early on? Because as Dr. Clark said, I think it's not just getting them at the early stage of first year or second year residency. We need to get them in medical school, maybe before. So I would interested in all of your thoughts.
So I'll just talk about what we're doing. So I'm involved with the new medical school in Fort Worth. It's like cowboy country, right? Washington is also on faculty with us. And we're really making an effort even before then to go out to high schools with a very intentional task. Obviously, COVID has made some issues with that, but we actually have a dean of diversity that is specifically working on the pipeline, and we're hitting specifically Latinx and Black communities to really just give them a taste, so they actually have a taste of medical school and what that could be like, and also the alternative pathways to get there. Because remember, we sort of, even in the medical school application, we're like, you went to community college, like, we're like, are we really going to look at you? No, absolutely. That's exactly the kind of person that we want, right? That has other life experiences. And so I do think, like you said, not even just medical school, but before that and you've got to be intentional. Unfortunately, in our first medical school class, we only have one Black male, which I think is atrocious. We're working really hard on that, and we're really working hard to change that as the application process moves forward, very intentionally.
I would say, I think, and we talked about this on our committee meetings, but my opinion is that a lot of organizations, when they talk about pipeline, it's like they go all the way back. They go to kindergarten and it's like, no, and I think there are ways that HPBA can partner with organizations that do work in the younger population, for sure. But I think where we can actively get involved is closer to the late high school, early college time period. And we can actually follow that. We can develop data from that. We're not going to develop data from a kindergartner. And and I think also, again, with us stating that our attempts are not to be performative, that is performative. When you're going back to third grade, like you're doing something, but are you really doing something? So I think those are the types of things that we have to consider. And mentorship is key. If you can make a connection with a person, that's where we do most of our impact, is when we actually have individual one-on-one connection and not group programs and et cetera. Programs are good. That's how you meet people. But at some point, there has to be an individual connection, because as a person, as an African-American woman in a field like this, I don't believe anything that you're saying until I see you actually do it. And so and that's because of history,
Learned
right? There's been a
experiences.
lot of words and very little action if you look over the past. And so what I want to see is action, but that means that we've got to connect. And I've got to see you live out what you claim to believe over a period of time.
I think on that note, it can be even more proximate. I completely agree. And that where can we make a difference kind of more immediate?
Yeah.
It's like the next time you go write a paper, think about, who did I write the last 10 papers with? They were all white men. So think about that. Like, oh my, like I didn't reach out to a medical student that was very qualified that might be a person of color. So I think we all can make an individual contribution next month, right? Like, so think about that the next time you go do something.
And I have to tell you, I have more of an ethical dilemma, like recruiting people into a pipeline that's leaky. That's a major focus for me, because it's like standard, right? Like if we have a hole in the cava, like we got to fix the hole and then pump blood in, right? Like you can't just keep pumping blood in and then watching it leak out consistently. And I think that we have a very real problem with retention of people already in the pipeline. And it is our most effective and immediately productive way of increasing our diversity within our membership. When we have residents that are being dismissed 20-fold more commonly than other residents, and it's based only on race, right? Then we have a problem. And if we can't address those small things, then it's sort of all the pipeline stuff sort of really is a bottleneck. And then the other comment that I wanted to make, and I think, I'm very mindful of the fact, Patrick, and I feel guilty all the time. I feel like I tax you so much. But in academia, the issues around sexual and gender minorities are just really not measured. They're not discussed. There's a paucity of data, and it's at this point ridiculous. And I'm really committed to try to work in not just this space, but in partnership with a lot of other surgical organizations to try to really change this. And I'm really excited about some of the stuff that we can do in partnership with some other folks. So those are just my two comments.
Even the suicide rates that you
I mean, it's
mentioned,
that was
I've seen in
remarkable.
here, and the bullying, like that is horrifying.
It's horrifying.
Yeah, it's terrible. And that's just in, this LGBTQ population. I mean, that exists in the same data is recapitulated across racial and ethnic minorities, women. I mean, it's terrible.
And the intersection of those things. I mean, I think we're just, at our AAS town hall, I couldn't sleep that night. I really didn't. The number of residents that reached out that were just, really devastated. It was difficult for me.
Along those lines, just a very small personal reflection that I say sheepishly. The issue of sexual and gender identity minorities is one that, as somebody who's not in that group, I'm not even sure that we're supposed to mention.
Yeah.
Patrick was a fellow at our program. like I would say 40% of our fellows are women.
Yep.
I wouldn't have ever commented that I've trained and will train
Yep.
sexual minority, and gender minorities, because I don't know if it's a little bit sort of foreboding to even bring up.
Right.
So the fact that Patrick is on this panel and that is now sort of a topic that is open
Exactly.
for discussion, I think
Yeah.
is itself super helpful.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think Patrick is one of the few people that I know you're out in every sort of arena of your life. I have so many friends that are out personally with me. They're not out professionally. They come, it's a daily process. Like every interaction, every new interaction is a process of going out. So we do have to be very mindful of that. But I think we're at the point now where everybody understands that we really need to talk about this and it's not taboo. We're gonna make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time.
I think we need to maybe think about changing the pipeline analogy too. I mean,
Yeah.
pipes have pressure.
Yes, that's
People
true.
kill themselves. I mean, I don't know. I've got to think about this and think about a
Come up
different
with a
analogy.
new word.
I mean, it's good.
We'll just call it
You
the
know,
path. We'll call it the path. Just the
Highway.
pathway.
Pacific Northwest person, we could have trails,
That's a trail.
something a little bit crunchier, I don't know.
Yeah, agreed.
I think we
All
have
right,
one final question.
One final
Yeah, I know
comment.
that we're running. Yeah, hi, my name is Jorge. I'm from WashU. I just kind of wanted to respond to what you said. I don't think that it has to be even kind of really asking people to out themselves, but just kind of being mindful of the way that we talk about some of these issues.
Yep.
I mean, just yesterday in the introduction to the presidential address, cross-dressing was used as a punchline. And I think
Yep.
for people that might not be out, that's like very difficult to hear.
Yeah,
So I think that would be an actionable first step that we can take, just change the way that we talk about these issues and hold each other accountable.
Yep.
As a trainee, I often feel nervous about objecting or raising, issues that I hear people say, misgendering people, all of those things, because it is a small world and I feel
Yeah.
like I don't have a lot of agency at this stage. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that
We-
comment.
we are your agents, like right here at least, okay?
And to
So-
Dr. Visser's point, I think we're making progress. I mean, but we're
Thank
gonna
you.
make missteps.
There you go. I actually,
Yeah.
thank you. And that is like, it's great to point it out. And so we should all be comfortable, like, we're all gonna misstep. And then it's upon us. We should also give grace.
Yes.
So if somebody says something to me that I find a little offensive and I said something back and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, give someone grace. So I think that that's upon all of us to like give grace. We're all gonna mess it up. So thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, don't ignore. Like, hey, I was upset about this. I'm sure you didn't mean it, but this is what I thought. And then, I'm not going to carry that around for the next 20 years and think badly of you. Like, we're all going to give grace too, because we're going to all mess it up.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Pollard.
Thank you.
Allowing us to do this.